science enthusiasts. My name is Jason Zakowski. I'm a high school chemistry teacher and a science communicator, but I'm also the dog dad of Bunsen and Beaker, the science dogs on social media. If you love science and you love pets, you've come to the right place. Put on your lab coat, put on your safety glasses, and hold on to your tail. This is the Science Pawdcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Science Pawdcast. Thanks for listening to us week after week. So I'm at my school today recording most of the podcast because my amazing CAST students, which stands for Creativity, Activity, and Service, it's part of the IB program. They are making hundreds and hundreds of cupcakes to sell in Pride Week next week. So I'm supervising them and pulling double duty recording my podcast. It's hard to believe we're almost at the summer, like 2 weeks left of school. Wow. We shall hop right to what's on the podcast this week. In science news, we're going to take a look at the PFAS chemicals, those forever chemicals, and maybe some breakthroughs in knocking them down a bit so they don't last forever in the ecosystems. In pet science, we're going to take a look at a study that found interesting data and interesting conclusions from families that had dogs and cats versus if kids developed Crohn's disease. Our guest and Ask an Expert is Dr. Asma Bashir, who's a neuroscientist and podcast host. Hey, dogs, what kind of fish performs brain surgery? A neurosturgeon. Okay. That's actually terrible. All right, on with the show, because there's no time like science time. This week in science news, let's talk about some good news around dangerous and long-lasting chemicals called PFAS. Now, PFAS chemicals persist in the environment for centuries, so these are chemicals that are going to last for a long time. They stand for polyfluoroalkyl substances. While the evidence and the research for what they do to humans is in its infancy, because they're so widespread, there have been links from these chemicals to things like cancer and reproductive issues. This study, which gives me some hope, comes from the Environmental Science and Technology Journal. Now, what did they use and what did they find? Using 3 different things, the PFAS chemicals was broken down. Now, before we get to what they did, if you've never heard of PFAS, here's just a little bit of background. PFAS chemicals are these chains of carbon that have fluorine on them. Now, a carbon-fluorine bond is really, really strong. It's among the strongest bonds that we teach kids about in chemistry. Why is that a big deal? Well, these sticky bonds, these really strong bonds, make any kind of chemical that has PFAS in it really useful. You'll find them in oil repellent coatings or cosmetics or firefighting foams. They last a long, long time and they can be used for many different things. So, of course, what happens when something's super useful and it has lots of different applications and it lasts for a long time without breaking down? Well, it's in a lot of different substances. Now, the problem is because they last so long and because we use them for so many different things, PFAS have been found everywhere. Even our drinking water. Now, we can get PFAS out of our drinking water using really good public sanitation and water treatment facilities. But one of the issues is that you'd have to upgrade your water treatment plant to contain these really, really powerful carbon filters or ion exchange resins. Now, a side effect of being able to filter out all the PFAS, which is good, right? You don't want that in your water. You're left with the PFAS still left over. So how do you get rid of it? Currently, in water treatment plants and in waste removal, UV light is combined with a sulfite, which breaks apart the carbon-fluorine bond a bit, allowing them to more safely dispose of the chemical. The new research uses iodine and UV like a surgical blade to bust up all of the PFAS bonding. The chemical that they're targeting is another type of PFAS. It's known as PFBS. So it's really stubborn to break down. This is where the UV and the iodine was used. Now, the good news is after a day of using UV radiation, less than about 1% of that really tough to break down chemical was left. And of course, they're using iodine as well. Now, iodine and sulfite work together to keep breaking down all of the PFAS molecules. UV light kicks an electron out of iodine And then that makes iodine a lot more reactive. And that iodine can step in and bond with some of the other stuff in PFAS, which in its combination and bonding makes it dangerous. So it's basically like just taking a puzzle that's dangerous for us and reordering the different pieces of the puzzle, which is something less dangerous. I think we can all imagine a chemical that's safe for us, but if we change it a bit, it's deadly. This is just the opposite. So the cocktail of chemicals was a mixture of sulfite and iodine, but using the power of UV light. The team that figured this out is taking their slurry and their UV light out into the real world, and they're going to try and treat PFAS with an engineering company that's in water in real life, not just like samples of water brought to the lab. This will take about 2 years, so I'm excited to revisit this in a couple of years to see how this goes. It's always kind of annoying that, science does great things for us. We always create these Frankenstein molecules that come back to bite us in the butt a bit. PFAS is one of them. But let's hope for hope. That's science news for this week. This week in Pet Science, let's talk about dogs, cats, and Crohn's disease? Okay. This study will be presented at Digestive Disease Week this year, 2022. So if you haven't heard of Crohn's disease or want to know a little bit more about it, it can affect any part of the gastrointestinal tract. It causes inflammation, pain, and it's chronic, so it occurs over and over and over again. So when I say it can affect everywhere of the gastrointestinal tract, that can be from your mouth all the way to your anus. But most people suffer from issues in their bowels and their colon. So the special part of the bowel is called the ileum, but it can affect the thickness of the walls. I guess what's really challenging about it is that the Crohn's disease can skip different parts of the digestive tract, the gastrointestinal tract. So you can have one part of the intestine that's normal and another part that's not. Now, getting back to the study and how that has to do with cats and dogs, they looked at families that had small children who grew up with cats, families that had small children that grew up with dogs. And the idea was, does a lack of exposure to microbes early in a child's life lead to some issues in their immune system and then potentially the development of Crohn's disease? So they took 4,300 people who answered a survey that had first-degree relatives of people with Crohn's disease. So it was like you're a parent and you have a child, or you're a sister and you have a brother. So first-degree relatives. And they used those responses to analyze environmental factors that were consistent with people that didn't have it or did have it. They also looked at the prevalence of pets in the household. The interesting conclusion they found was that exposure to dogs and kids from age 5 to 10 was linked to healthy guts and a good balance between good gut bacteria in their immune system. In households with just cats, there wasn't the same response. And that's what the team mentioned, is they'd really like to get to the bottom of why dogs, but not cats. Gut microbiome and health of the gastrointestinal tract was also linked to living with more people in the first couple years of their life. Now, of course, questionnaires aren't necessarily the best scientific tool, but it does give you a starting point for conversation and further study. The environmental factors of what makes a healthy gut and what doesn't make a healthy gut is just something that we're trying to study right now. We even looked at it in the podcast previously in Science News, taking poop from a healthy person and putting into somebody who's sick has profound effects on their overall health. I looked a little bit more into this questionnaire, and they had lots of environmental factors that they were looking at. Number of bathrooms, how much drinking water they got, what type of drinking water they got, did they drink unpasteurized milk? And all of this was good environmental data. And what stood out was dogs, having dogs. And obviously, like I said, having more people in the household when the child was young. So sorry, cats, this is a win for dogs today. Your time may come later, but for right now, it appears having dogs when kids are little helps the gut bacteria and wards off a bit of Crohn's disease. That's Pet Science for this week. Hello, everybody. The Science Podcast will always be free to download and listen to. You'll never have to worry about paying for it. But we have some amazing ways that you can help us out with running the show. The first one is to think about becoming a patron on Patreon. And we call our patrons now the Paw Pack. There's a whole bunch of awesome perks and different tiers of support. We also have a very detailed and excellent merch store. And if you're listening to this in time, we have pre-orders of the Bunsen 2.0 stuffy that was just adorable. You can check it out. There's also the Beaker stuffy on our store and a whole bunch of comfy clothes. The third thing you can do is give us a good rating. Rate the podcast wherever you're listening to this. We'd love to get a great rating from you. Okay, back to the show. It's time for Ask an Expert on the Science Podcast, and I have Dr. Asma Bashir with me today, who's a podcast host and neuroscientist. How are you doing today, doctor?
I am doing phenomenally. How are you?
I'm good. Where are you calling into the world from?
I am joining you from Nova Scotia, which for listeners who are not quite familiar with Canadian geography, that's actually on the Atlantic side. So I'm in the maritime province of Nova Scotia. And if we can super quickly do a land acknowledgement, Halifax, the city that I'm in, is in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people who have cared for this land for thousands of years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. Thanks for doing that.
No problem.
So a couple quick questions. Asma, have you lived on the East Coast of Canada your whole life? Or are you there for work, school, moved there?
We moved here. My partner and I moved here after actually having lived in Scotland. I have lived in quite a few places. I'm from Toronto, but I have lived in the States. I have lived in the UK twice at this point, also in the Middle East, in Doha, Qatar. And I did my graduate degree in Vancouver. So I was there for about 4 years. So I've lived on both coasts at this point and also in the middle.
Goodness, you're so lucky. You lived on both coasts of Canada?
I have. Have you?
No, I am
not yet.
No, I'm pretty bound to our property in Alberta. We live on a farm, so.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, my wife's family has this farm. I was a serf basically, and I married royalty, so now I'm by marriage a landowner, I guess. Anyways,
that's one way to put it.
Yeah. So West Coast has ruggedness, but it's kind of, like a rainforest. The East Coast is rocky and it's got that. Do you find that too? I've been to the West Coast. I have not been to the East Coast of Canada yet.
Yes, they both, I think, have their own charm. I would say Vancouver in particular, because that's where I spent most of my time, is absolutely stunning. Just looking out the window and having mountains. Just, oh my gosh, it's sometimes breathtaking, especially because they're just eternally snow-capped. Oh, it looks like a painting, like a Bob Ross painting. I don't know if you know who Bob Ross is.
No, we love Bob Ross in our house.
Oh, yay. Okay, good. I was going to feel a little old.
Happy little trees.
On the East Coast. Oh, yay. Oh my God, I love that. And then on the East Coast, I would say it's also pretty, but I think it has more of a rockiness to it. It reminds me a lot of Scotland.
I've heard that. Yeah.
Yes, which is kind of ironic that we moved from Scotland to New Scotland and then felt like we basically didn't change atmosphere at all. The area did not change in the way that it looks, or the weather. It's really temperamental here, where we have snow one morning and by evening an entire foot of snow is just gone, which is so different from Toronto because the snow will stay.
Yeah.
Forever.
It's like Alberta. When it snows, you're in there for the long haul till a Chinook rolls through or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. We have Chinooks quite often. I don't think we call it that, but we have the ups and downs that are absolutely wild. But
so you stay too long, you're going to get that East Coast accent. I don't know if you picked up any slang or words.
I don't know if I want that one. I have quite a few accents at my disposal, but that one I'm not sure I'll add.
That one? Okay, cool.
Sure.
It sounds good when they're singing. Don't get that's very, very beautiful. No, I'm just kidding. I've got many friends and coworkers actually from the East Coast, and I won't put this in the podcast, but they can turn it on and off the East Coast accent. It's kind of hilarious.
That's wild. That's so cool. I love it when people do that. I probably do that too much, so I won't do that.
So, Asma, I introduced you as Dr. Bashir.
Yes.
Could you talk to us a little bit about your educational training?
I would love to.
Yay!
So I started my undergraduate degree in London, England, and then moved to the States for the rest of my undergrad, which I did in psychology. And I did that at Boston University. I loved it there and kind of fell in love with neuroscience by way of an accidental course, Introduction to Neuroscience, which I took as part of my general science requirement. And I spoke with the professor there, and he was like, I think you should be a graduate student at some point. Look into it. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. At that point, by the time you're in the middle of undergrad, I just felt like I was like, let's get this done so I can start my life. I don't know if everybody else feels the same way, but I definitely was like not thinking about school in the future at all. And then I took a year off and thought, okay, I think I can consider it now. I decided to venture west for the first time in my life. And that's when I joined UBC, the University of British Columbia. And I joined the graduate program in neuroscience and worked under the supervision of Dr. Cheryl Wellington, who is predominantly an Alzheimer's disease researcher, but she also did traumatic brain injury on the side. And it became one of the bigger aspects of her lab. And that's the team that I joined, the TBI team.
Traumatic brain injury. Okay. Yeah.
Correct. Traumatic brain injury. And I could talk a little bit more about that if you'd like.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a second. I just have a couple, I always ask folks like you who have a doctorate or went further than I did. Like I've got an undergrad in chemistry and to be a teacher, a science teacher, I have science training, but like nothing past that. What got you into psychology, science in the first place? You said you swung into neuroscience from a course, but what was the grab that made you go into the route of post-secondary when you were young, or was there one?
Well, it was kind of a given that I would pursue university. And I know that sounds really strange, but both my parents are university educated. Gotcha. I think that was just the assumption that, you don't have to pursue something that you're going to do for the rest of your life, but it is a wonderful period for growth.
Gotcha.
So as an extension of grade 12, you finish that up. You're only 18 years old, going out into the big world of having a full-time job and all that. It was an option, but it was definitely my parents' second option for me.
Like we would strongly prefer you to go to post-secondary kind of thing.
Precisely.
Gotcha. Yeah. And my parents were that way too.
Yep. Good. So my parents aren't alone.
No.
Yeah, they definitely were kind of hinting at different options. And thankfully my parents are laissez-faire in a good way, but also, really big on education in other spaces. So they said, you can go wherever you want and you can study whatever you want, which was great. And that was somewhat of a bad thing for me because I think maybe I would have benefited from someone just saying, yeah, you should study this, because I liked far too many subjects.
Oh, so you were like a Swiss Army knife. You had all of these. You open it up and you're like, oh, it's a can opener, a psychology. Is that, I don't know. I guess so. I don't know.
No. That's a really good way to put it, because I loved science, but I kind of feel like a bit of a fraud because I didn't just love science. I loved writing and English, and I loved math. And yeah, I really did love learning about the human body, but I just as much loved learning music and
I love
singing
that.
and things like that. So when I got to the stage where I was thinking about university and making some plans, I thought, okay, I should study something that can be a good stepping stone for a lot of different things. And psychology was perfect for me because if I really wanted to, I could go into marketing, or I could make it a little bit more science focused and go into med school if I really wanted to. And I had considered being a pediatrician or being a dentist, or I just wanted to help people. That was the common thread. But other than that, I had nothing. I also thought that perhaps I could go into therapy, but I wasn't 100% sold on it. But I thought psychology, that's a good place to start.
It's a good framework.
It is. Yeah. It can set a good foundation for absolutely anything. And so that's why I decided to do that. I also love people. People are pretty cool more often than not. Sometimes you kind of go, yeah, maybe not all people, but for the most part, I think I liked understanding how people thought and how people felt and how they interacted with those around them that they trusted and people that they didn't trust and had reservations about. All of that was very, very interesting to me. And with a psychology degree, I also had a lot of electives. So I had the opportunity to learn a bunch of languages while I was an undergrad as well. And I'm so thankful and grateful for that, because it creates connection and it creates community. And so, yeah, that's how that happened.
I got to take one psychology class as one of my electives in my science degree.
Did you? What
I
did
think
you
I had
think of it?
2 electives. No, I really liked it. I took a psychology and a sociology. And just because I was just like, I was interested in the social, I don't even know if you call them social sciences, but like I was in all of these like organic chemistry and inorganic chemistry and calculus so it was kind of cool to take something that looked at the world from a different lens. And that's all it is.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It helps you understand yourself, but I think it also helps you understand others as well.
You took a course in Introduction to Neuroscience, and that's what you did. You focused on in your PhD, and then brain injury. Could you chat a little bit about some of the things you found or found interesting or used in your research for your PhD?
Absolutely. So I will do that in a second. I'll give a tiny bit of background as to what traumatic brain injury is, just in case that's a little bit helpful. So traumatic brain injury, or TBI for short, is just a fancy way of saying an external force has impacted your head. And oftentimes you feel a little different. The number one complaint of patients who've had a TBI is headaches. So they just feel kind of groggy, not so great. Sometimes they have dizziness or vertigo. Sometimes their memory is impaired or they're more impulsive. That's one that can have a pretty big effect, especially on families. Let's say you have access to money and now you're gambling. A lot of horrible things can happen after you've sustained a traumatic brain injury. Even though we've studied it for quite a few decades now, there's still a lot that we don't know about TBI. So what I did was help to optimize a model of head injury. So what we do, we use models to help us understand the human condition, especially when we don't have that many human samples available to us. And because there is a scarcity, there are not so many human samples that have had a history of TBI available to all researchers. We use animals to help us explore what happens to the brain. Okay. So we look at how the animal behaves after the injury, immediately thereafter. So we measure their balance and any gait differences, the way we'd look at a person who comes into the hospital after a head injury and says, I'm feeling a little dizzy. And the doctor will say, okay, can you walk from here to here? And they'll assess the way that they walk and if there is any strangeness there. So we do the same thing for our animals as well. We're also interested in seeing if there are memory deficits because patients do complain about memory deficits. So we want to make sure our model that we've created has that as well. And like I mentioned with impulsivity, because it's one of these big things that can have massive ramifications to a family, we want to see if our model also captures impulsivity. And
in the animals.
Yeah, which is really, really cool because after repeated hits, we did find that like in a person who sustained repeated head injuries, the animal also displays impulsivity, which was so cool, so wild. We weren't entirely expecting for that to be the case, but we found that if you basically presented a situation to a rat, in this case, of picking one sugar pellet now because they love sugar, or they have to wait for a particular period of time and they can get 5 sugar pellets. We found that the animals that had sustained the injury actually would rather just take the single sugar pellet now. They didn't want to wait. They were like, no, give it to me now. I just want to taste the sugar right now. But the animals that hadn't been subjected to the injury were actually like, no, I'll be patient because I know the reward is going to be 5 times more than if I had just taken the sugar pellet now. That I thought was really cool because you can do an experiment like that in people. And individuals who have sustained a number of hits have shown traits of impulsivity. You can even do this experiment with kids. It's called the marshmallow test.
I was going to say, it sounds like the marshmallow test.
It's exactly like the marshmallow test. So it's really, really cool that we can take this human-based experiment, do it in our animals, and we can say the model that we've created within our lab is a very valuable piece in this puzzle to help us understand what's happening to the brain after injury and also what the recovery profile might look like. So if we have ideas of what return to work and return to play look like for patients, that can help us to prevent second impact syndrome, where someone gets another impact after a very short period of time and they end up perhaps getting a blood clot in their brain or they die very suddenly, and it can be really, really tragic. So the more we understand about the brain injury side in our model, the more we'll understand about the human side as well. And that's even more exciting when it comes into therapeutics, because we don't have a one-size-fits-all drug for TBI. And if we understand how we can alleviate or ameliorate a condition in a mouse or in a rat or in a ferret, in our case, we did all three of those models, then when we go to clinical trials, it's more likely to work in a human being. And that's what we were really, really proud of with this model that we created.
Figuring Out Family isn't your ordinary podcast. It's a completely new experience that helps you make your family the best it can be by giving you the deep insights to help your family thrive. You'll learn how to help your family have more productive conversations and manage life's disappointments too. You'll feel inspired by the special guests that are experts in their field of family relationships. Get valuable tips for dealing with difficult family members, repair broken relationships, improving your parenting skills, and keeping your children happy and healthy. Check it out now.
Is that just because like the brain is so complicated, even though two people might be presenting the same quote unquote symptoms, the part of the brain that's injured is so vastly different depending? Like, I don't know if I'm on the right track here.
No, you are. There's a saying within the traumatic brain injury and the spinal cord injury communities that if you've met one patient with TBI or SCI, you've met only one patient, because what that one person has gone through is likely to be so vastly different than someone else who's gone through a very similar injury, whether it's, the biomechanics of the injury. So they might have been hit the exact same way. So to kind of answer your question more directly, it might even have less to do with the particular brain region that's affected. That could be part of it, but it could just be that the person is different, is stochastically different. They happen to be different and they respond differently to that injury. I think that's absolutely fascinating though.
It is. It's the more we learn, the more, not we, because you know more than me, but the more I learn about the brain, it's just what we are as humans. We are our brain. Like,
absolutely.
You change the brain, you're not you. You're a new you, basically.
Exactly. And isn't that one of the things that's so frightening about long COVID, where we're starting to understand that there might be things that change about our brains after having had COVID. So I think it's going to be an interesting couple of years as we find out more and more. I haven't read those papers in detail, but I've seen some of the headlines.
I have heard that the sluggishness, a colleague of ours at the school has long COVID, and that's one of the things that he's struggling with is concentration. A podcast guest I talked to has long COVID and he's struggling with concentration. You probably know Dr. Raven Baxter, Raven, the science maven, right? And she quite openly on Twitter has talked about her struggles with long COVID. So, I feel bad for those folks because it's not something you think that would affect your brain, right? When you're talking about traumatic brain injuries, the first thing that comes to mind is like a car accident. But maybe you could speak to that. Like, is there, that's what comes to my mind, but there's so many other ways you can get a TBI. Is there something we haven't, that the average person hasn't thought about that may cause a TBI? I would love to know.
Absolutely. I'd love to share.
Okay.
So the number one cause of traumatic brain injuries is not a motor vehicle accident, and it's not playing sports. That's also another one that people think
I was going to say
especially
football or something.
Yeah, contact sports. Yeah, neither of those are the number one cause. It's actually falls. People falling down as they're making their way about the world, especially our very young population and our very old population. That's the number one cause of traumatic brain injuries. And it's kind of frightening because we have a rapidly aging population overall here in Canada, and people are living independently for longer as well. And that often means that when they live by themselves, they can, slip and fall on stairs or a slippery part of their floor, getting out of the shower. That's a really popular one as well, where people fall down, hit their head, and they're just not the same afterwards.
Wow.
Yeah, surprise, number one is falls.
I guess that makes sense. Like, there's way more people walking about doing things than in football, for example.
True. Yes. So I think sports, if I remember correctly, it's about 10% of all of TBIs. So number 1 is falls. Number 2 is motor vehicle collisions. And I believe it's a little bit different in lower to middle income countries. There, the number 1 cause is car accidents. Yeah.
You know, a comedian I was listening to, I forget the comedian, they made a darkly humorous joke that, like, if you try and trip a dog, they're just like, why would you do that? And they're okay because they're dogs. But like a human that trips, that could be the end of them. And I guess that just hits, I'm not, you know, it's not funny, but it's just an observation that we're kind of fragile.
Very much so. Especially
we're so fragile.
Brain. Oh, goodness me. Yeah, our brains are such delicate beings, and they're encased in these skulls, these, you know, amazing layers of protection, but it's not foolproof. There are things that can happen that affect the integrity of our brain. Our brains can also slosh within our skulls as well, and that can cause damage to the surface of our brain. A lot can happen. Being careful is a good thing. It's okay to be careful.
I have one more question before we move on.
Yes.
And if you want to talk about something that I've missed, feel free to let me know. Cause again, like this isn't my area of expertise. Aside from impulsivity and say memory loss, what are some other, and headaches you mentioned, are there some other symptoms, like things that people go through with TBIs?
Yeah. A lot of them just have to do with normal behaviors. So some people will notice difference in their appetite. So they'll feel super hungry, or they won't feel hungry at all. So some people kind of hypothesize that the centers of the brain that control hunger, breathing, that kind of stuff, the midbrain gets affected by traumatic brain injuries. In addition to that, we also have sleep disturbances that can happen after TBI. So
you get way too sleepy, or you have insomnia, one of the two?
Exactly. Yeah. So you can have either end of the spectrum, which can be really not only disorienting, but kind of frightening, because if you are lethargic all the time and you fall asleep at the wheel, for instance, or you're out and about, that can be really, really scary. I think those are the big ones. Number 1 is headaches, sleep disturbances, memory, impulsivity, and aggression is also another one. And that sometimes is tied in with impulsivity.
Right.
And that one has also made the news more recently, especially with American football players and sometimes their interactions with partners and spouses.
Tragic endings.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's really, really frightening.
Like wrestlers, like in the WWE, right? The ones that take headshots with chairs. I have one more question. I could keep asking you so many questions.
Please do. I love questions.
Okay. So when the brain is injured,
yes,
what can science do to help? Or is there very little besides time? Is that a bad question? I don't know.
No, that's a phenomenal question.
Yeah.
Because it kind of speaks to how little we do know. There's no, again, magic pill to kind of help generally with respect to traumatic brain injury. What a lot of doctors will do are treat the symptoms. They'll say, okay, so you're dealing with insomnia. We'll give you medication to try and get you to go to sleep. You're dealing with some, depression. You can have also emotional disturbances. I forgot to mention that one. So they'll try to prescribe you an antidepressant.
Okay.
But, one of the wishes for a lot of traumatic brain injury researchers is you come in after an injury, you come into the ER, and there's just a medicine they can give you right away to hit all of the major things. But because it is so heterogeneous and you don't know how the person is going to display their symptoms, if they're going to have any symptoms at all, a lot of people recover with no real issue, no lingering symptoms of the injury. So it's really ideal for me to sit here and say, I wish one day there is a pill, but there isn't. And so doctors end up just treating each symptom in isolation or in tandem together.
Somebody comes in with a broken arm.
Yeah.
There's pretty prescribed treatment for that. Somebody comes in with, some kind of blocked artery in their heart. It's super serious, but there's a prescribed treatment for that.
Exactly.
The brain is just infinitely complex.
Absolutely. And so time is an important component. I think it's a good thing that you mentioned that, because a lot of times they'll go, okay, we'll assess you now and we'll assess you in a couple of hours and see if it gets any worse and make sure you're not vomiting and make sure you don't pass out, and we'll make sure everything is okay. But yeah, there's nothing that they can say, you've had a TBI, we'll give you this the same way. If you've had a stroke, they'll give you X, Y, and Z. Yeah.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is something that I've read.
Yeah.
And again, I can't remember if this source was a good source. But after a hard hit to the head, a fall, concussion from sports, whatever, a second hit to the head is magnitudes worse for your brain. Is that true? Is that false? Or is it random?
That is true. There is a lot of research that's being done now to figure out what that interval might be, because there's a huge question mark. There was, I believe she was a Canadian player. I think she played football. I don't know if it was tackle football, but this player ended up getting hurt either in practice or at a game. And less than a week later, she had sustained a second concussion and she ended up passing away. Ooh. Not too long thereafter. And I think she got a bill named after her. I'm blanking on it now. I should look it up. But yeah, it's to make sure that you get approval to play after you've sustained a concussion so that you don't end up with second impact syndrome. Yeah, it's a very, very serious thing. But this, I really wish that I had remembered the name. What's her name?
Oh, I put you on the spot. So people listening, we did not rehearse this question. This is just me with a giant list of follow-up things here, throwing at our experts. So
I'll take it. It is something that I need to definitely brush up on, because it was a sobering realization that impact interval was an important part of the story of TBI.
So pro tip, if you play hockey, sometimes it's called, you got your bell rung, maybe in football too. After you get your bell rung from a fall or whatever, you need to get checked out before you decide to do dangerous activities that may lead to a second
Absolutely.
thing. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think be as honest as you can with your medical staff, because they're there to protect you. I know that for some players, they want to get as much time on the field or on the rink as possible. And I guess on the long term, you're looking for professional opportunities. But if your life is in your hands, just pick life. Pick your life. Yeah,
that's ended a couple famous hockey players' careers prematurely from getting too many hits in a row, too close together. Wear a helmet when you're biking, I guess, too, hey?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, protect your noggin if you can.
I veto that. No, I don't veto that. I second that 100%.
You second that? Yeah.
There we go.
I think I need to wear a helmet pretty much the whole time. I'm kind of clumsy, so anyways.
Oh, are you?
I'm very tall, so I'm constantly hitting my head on things. So
that's what it is. Yeah, I don't have that problem. I'm 5'1 3/4. So
there you go. You're the perfect size to fly in a plane, I'll tell you.
Oh my gosh, I feel so bad for people who are taller than me. How do you even find comfort?
You don't. You just you sit there and you cry internally and you scream. You hope there's a good movie on, or you brought, actually now with the Nintendo Switch is really portable. I think that's the next time I fly. That's what I'm going to be doing. I'll be playing some Zelda or something.
Smart.
Exciting. You have this amazing podcast. You are a podcast host just like me.
Yeah.
Could you talk about your podcast? Talk to us about it. What would you like us to know about it?
I would love to share the origin story of the podcast.
Yeah, let's go.
So it starts in 2019. I was a final year PhD student at UBC, and I was doing a lot of SciComm. A lot. I was at that point one of the vice presidents of our graduate student association, and then later on became one of the presidents. And what was great about that position was I got a chance to collaborate with Science World and our local space center to interact with our greater community to talk about the amazing work that's being done at UBC. And I thought, okay, there are only so many places that I can physically go to talk about this work. And so many of my peers have amazing work as well. And I could see their excitement about it. I also wanted to kind of put a spotlight on scientists and people in STEM who were minoritized in different ways. So I'm a Muslim woman. I have parents from East Africa. And I always walked into spaces and felt like, gosh, I represent my entire community, because very often I was the only one of my community.
Hello, this is Chris Sass, host of Insider's Guide to Energy podcast. If you haven't had a chance to listen to Insider's Guide to Energy and you're passionate about energy, want to know what's happening in the energy transition, or hear about new and emerging technology making a difference in energy, this is the place for you. We have a main show that comes out every week called Insider's Guide to Energy. We have Insider's Guide to Energy stories where we tell you about interesting people and jobs in the industry. Then we have a Student and Future Leaders program where we have a job board and content just for you. So if you want to find out more, subscribe now to Insider's Guide to Energy and follow us on YouTube. We look forward to bringing you the latest. See you soon.
And you're the only one that looked like you when you came into our room.
Exactly. And I thought that was a little inaccurate. I knew there were far more of us collectively as minoritized people who were in these spaces, who were in neuroscience, who were in pharmacology, who were in chemistry. And I wanted to talk to these people. So to bring those two worlds together, my psychom, prowess, if you will, and my desire to talk to people and give them a chance to tell their stories, I created Her Royal Science. And shout out to the Center for Brain Health where I was working. They got me funding to get me started.
Oh, awesome.
Oh, it was amazing. I couldn't believe it. When I finally got that email saying that, yeah, we want to back you, I was like, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. It was also really daunting because then I had to go through with it.
Then you had to, the money was on the line. You got to perform.
So I put out my first episode with my partner in June of 2019. And since then, we've published 3 seasons of interviews that I'm so happy to share with the world. It's wonderful to give researchers the spotlight that they deserve. You often don't get a chance to think about the people behind the research when you read an article, but these people are full, creative, insightful people who've had lesson upon lesson in their lives that they'd love to share. I think that giving researchers the opportunity to talk about their work, whether they're in research or they're not in research anymore, is so beautiful. And it's a way to bring the tower of academia out from behind the gates and say, here are people in STEM. Listen to their stories. They're beautiful stories.
Our podcasts are similar in that we highlight these amazing scientists. You're a scientist too. So we're highlighting you on our show. And, our focus isn't necessarily as focused as yours is on people underrepresented in STEM, but we do go out of our way to find those voices on our show.
I love that about your show, by the way. I do.
Thank you.
That. Yeah.
I love, I like telling this story. So I'll tell a quick story. Mm-hmm. After I talk to scientists on the podcast or on our Twitter spaces, I teach high school science, right?
Yeah.
And so I had, the first time this happened that I knew it was so important, I had this young rocket scientist on my podcast, Nia Butler-Craig. I don't know if you know her from Twitter.
I know her, yeah.
You know Nia? Yeah. So she's, I don't know her personally aside from being on the space, and she's amazing, bubbly person. So after every guest, I highlighted the scientist or the guest to my class for the day, right? I was like, this is who I talked to. So I was like, this is Nia. She's a rocket scientist. And I had a couple kids who looked like Nia, and they, in a class of kids that didn't necessarily look like them. Yeah. And they saw Nia, and I saw their eyes, and I was like, this is important, right? Because I'm a middle-aged white guy teaching all these kids, right? I'm like the stereotypical Bill Nye the Science guy, Carl Sagan guy. And I was like, this is important because I want everybody in my class to have role models, and highlighting that is important for kids because when you see yourself, you in area of science, I think it's easier to pursue that science. And I guess you were in rooms where you were the only one, and I can't imagine how hard that would have been.
Yeah, it had some moments of, I think, frustration just because you have to either explain things that perhaps you don't necessarily feel require explanation. Someone else can just look it up on their own.
Just Google it.
Yeah, I know. I think that would be a good thing for people to take away from experiences where they might be asking someone about themselves. Allow them to volunteer the information if they want to. And if not, you can go ahead and look it up on your own. I do have to give a shout out to my mom, though, because I didn't feel like science was a space that I couldn't walk into because I knew of other Black women in STEM long before I was even in STEM. And because I wasn't locked into this career of, I need to pursue science as my end goal, it was nice to just know that they existed so that I knew it was an option. I think that's one of the things that you're kind of talking about. The students that saw Naya didn't necessarily need to go into rocket science, and they might never go into it, but just knowing that it's a possibility because women like Naya exist. I think that's really cool. And I like that you're doing this.
Well, you said it better than I did. You said it way better than I did. So
I think we both said it well. I think so.
Where can people find your podcast? Is it all over the place?
It is all over the place.
Yay.
If you want to listen on Apple Podcasts, please do. Spotify, Google Podcasts. We're on Player FM too. I forgot about that at one point. And SoundCloud as well. This is where we actually host the podcast. You can also listen to it on our website, which is herroyalscience.com.
We'll make sure all those links are in our show notes so people can
that sounds great.
Click right to it in a second.
Yay.
Well, thanks for talking to us about your podcast. We're into the standard podcast questions for us, and our audience really likes these. They're kind of silly, but they can be profound. Yeah. And the first question is, wait a second, I've screwed up here. I gotta get it in the right order. Okay, there we go. The first question, is a pet story, because we mix science and animals on the podcast. We like we like to ask our guests about animals in their life. Do you have a pet story you could share with us?
I do. I had to think about this because personally, I've only ever had goldfish, which I think is kind of sad because I always wanted a cat. However, my grandparents had a farm cat / barn cat for a really long time. And this cat's name was Jack. Jack was great because even though Jack had a job, he had to, make sure things stayed clean, no vermin and all that kind of stuff. He was also really sweet and really cuddly, and you could feed him all kinds of cool things. Jack disappeared after a little while, and we didn't know where Jack was. And we're like, oh my God, is he okay? Did he, get sick or something? And Jack came back pregnant. And we were like,
what?
Did no one
Jackie.
Yeah, that's exactly what I said when I was a kid. I was like, we can't call him Jack. He's not a him.
Oh my.
So Jack gave birth to 4 kittens, which I was so over the moon for. We used to go back to visit my grandparents every summer. And so that was one of the highlights of my summer. Yeah, getting to go back and play with his kittens. And then eventually they moved house and they didn't really need Jack anymore. So I think he was rehomed to another place. But yeah, that's my story.
That is a great story.
And saying it now, I realized that it was the late 90s. I think he was called Jack because of the Titanic.
Oh.
I hadn't connected
when
that.
He really should have been called Rose.
He should have been Rose.
Adorable.
The things you realize as you grow older.
Adorable. That is a great story.
Thanks.
The other question that's standard on the podcast is the super fact. We asked, I know. And I've had a lot of fun and learned a lot. We asked our guests to share something that they know that would blow our minds a bit. And the irony is we've been talking about the brain / the mind. Do you have a super fact you could share with us?
If you love tabletop role-playing games and want to explore methods to enhance your own campaigns, including exploring the psychology behind various aspects of role-playing, then you should check out my show, the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. Each week we discuss new topics and give you tricks of the trade for how to incorporate those concepts into your own campaigns.
I do. I don't know if it's one that you've heard before, but we'll see.
Okay.
Have you heard of phantom limbs?
Okay, I have, but I have heard of them in the same way I've heard of like things like musicals, like like Chicago. Like I know it exists. I've never watched it.
Okay, sweet.
Anyways.
So that I can tell you all about them.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so phantom limbs, it's a sensation that happens after a person has lost a limb at some point in time. It actually sometimes happens in people who were born without a limb of some kind, so either an arm or a leg. What's wild, though, is that in a subset of amputees or people without a particular limb, they actually have what's called phantom limb pain. And it can be absolutely excruciating to feel pain in a limb that does not exist. But the reason why that happens is because your cortex still has the representation of that limb. And it's in a space within the brain called the somatosensory cortex. And even though you might not have a left hand, your brain still thinks there's a left hand there. And a lot of people are now trying to explore particular therapies that might be successful in helping people to alleviate or ameliorate some of this phantom limb pain. But that was actually one of the first things that I learned in Neuroscience 101 that made me go, oh my goodness, the brain is fascinating.
So like a circuit, you have I don't know, I'll use my 3D printers as an example. Like you have the circuitry to print flexible filament, but the machine doesn't have flexible filament, but it still thinks it can print flexible filament even though it doesn't have it.
Exactly.
It's got the circuitry to do. Oh, wow. That is wild.
Exactly. And what people have found is that sometimes, especially if it's an amputation, the nerves around the site of the amputation can become even more sensitive. And so when pain signals are sent, it feels like an even more intense pain than it would have been. There are people who feel like their hand is just clenching permanently. And because they don't have the visual feedback of unclenching their fist, their brain keeps telling them, you're clenching your fist, you're clenching your fist, you're hurting yourself, you're clenching your fist. And so mirror boxes have been somewhat successful in helping people to get the visual feedback that they need. So they basically put the hand that's intact into this box. They have a mirror so that it looks like the hand that's missing actually exists again. And they get the visual feedback that they need. They can unclench their right hand and it looks like they're unclenching their left. And the pain
And then their brain is like that. Wow. That is wild.
Isn't it? It's absolutely so fascinating. You should watch a video of it. I think they still have them up on YouTube. It is absolutely extraordinary. People will say, yeah, it looks like my hand and I feel the clenching sensation dissipating. So cool.
That is a super fact.
Yay!
I have a super follow-up question.
Yes.
Because the circuitry is still there, is there hope then of like, or maybe we can make use of it already? Because I've seen sort of like prosthetics that something can tap into the circuitry. I don't know.
Yes. In fact, people find that the use of their prostheses actually helps that sensation go away because the prosthetic feels so much like their actual hand that the phantom limb pain sometimes only appears at night when the prosthesis is off.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Bananas. B-A-N-A-S. Bananas.
Hello, Gwen Stefani.
That was from Kelly Kapoor on The Office. That was the reference. Today is bananas. B-A-B-N-A-S. Have you know that episode? I don't know.
Yes, I do. I love The Office. I've watched it too many times.
Yes, too many times is right. Okay, that is a super fact. Thank you for sharing. The last section of the podcast, we get to know a little bit more about our guest. It's the important to you section where we ask our guests to talk a little bit about something they're passionate about outside of their area of study or your podcasting. And Susie, and you wanted to chat about writing and poetry, which is amazing. What's going on there?
I have loved writing, as I kind of mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, ever since I was very young. And I started writing poetry and actually performing spoken word poetry while I was a graduate student. And it became a wonderful venue for catharsis, to just, get whatever was on my heart off and just, out into the world and get the kind of feedback that I think I needed and validation, which I think we all need in all the spaces that we walk into. So I encourage listeners, especially if they have other things that they're working on, to seek out artistic pursuits that might not necessarily be your entire professional focus. But if you find joy in these spaces, if you find catharsis in anything that you do outside of your work, hold on to that. That is such an amazing feeling that you get when you have a venue and a space where you feel safe. Yeah.
Do you read a lot? Like, or
poetry or generally?
No, this is a dumb question, but I find I'm with more my work with the podcast and then the Bunsen and Beaker account. I used to read so much, and it's something that I've lost a bit of. And I've talked to a lot of people, and they said the same thing. Like they have to really make time to read anything, poetry, books, magazines. Do you do a lot of reading?
I went through the same thing while I was in graduate school, where I just stopped reading almost entirely for fun, which was really sad to me. I had only the time in the world to just focus on reading papers and making sure that I was up to date within that field. But after I finished my postdoc, I actually started reading again.
Oh, good for you.
Which has been really, really great. I, at this point, am really into biographies. So I finished a couple last year, which was really great. I read Michelle Obama's book, Becoming. I read, it's called A Song for You. It's a biography about Whitney Houston's life written by her best friend. That was really good as well. Yeah, I've read a lot of biographies recently, and it's been lovely because I think it actually continues to hone my skills as a person who asks questions, because I kind of think of other things and other people's life stories. And it's been good. It's been fun. And it's been great to jump back into the world of reading because I loved it as a kid. And I think I might even love it more now.
Isn't that, see, when I was in high school, my best subject was English. Was it? Yeah, I was really good at writing essays. Yeah. And until I was talked out of it by a teacher, I was going to go into law school. Can you believe it?
Wait. Can we go back to that? Why did someone try to talk you out of that?
Because they knew I had a passion for science, but it wasn't maybe what I was the best at, right?
Okay, I see.
Yeah, and they're like, no, and I didn't really want to go to law school. It's just because I was the top student at XYZ. They're like, oh, you should be a lawyer kind of thing, right? I found it easy to BS, basically. I don't know, but... So we're at the end of our chat. This has been so good. I've enjoyed myself so much. It's hard in audio, but I've been smiling from ear to ear this entire conversation. My mouth is sore. I don't know. Do you get that when you interview people? Your mouth is sore?
Yeah, I have to do the face massages.
Yeah. I was just doing that. I was going, yeah.
Yes, no, but that's very good sign. And it has been an absolute pleasure. As we were speaking before, it's sometimes a little bit daunting to be on the side of the microphone and answer questions, but I'm just hoping I did a decent enough job.
It was so good. Can people follow you on social media? Do you have an account?
Absolutely.
I know you have a website. We'll make sure we link that in the show notes.
Yes, no, please do follow me on Twitter and Instagram. Same handle. It's at @her_science, her science.
Awesome. We will make sure that's hyperlinked in the show notes as well.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Doc, thanks so much for giving up your time to chat on the Science Pawdcast. It's a informative, inspirational, sometimes moving conversation. So I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it as well. I have been wanting to be on here for so long and you finally made it happen. So
yeah. So normally there's a family section. We're not having one this week. Adam got a bug. He is very, very sick. Not feeling well. So I guess there's no family section this week. I'm sorry. You'll have to catch us next week there. That's it for this week's show. Thanks for coming back week after week to listen to us. Special thanks to Dr. Asma Bashir, who talked to us about traumatic brain injuries, writing, and her podcast. We'd also like to give a special shout out to our top tier Paw Pack members. I love saying that. Our patrons are now called the Paw Pack. Take it away, Chris.
Anne Schlerm, Sharon Dotson, Peggy McKeel, Chris Kelly, Samantha Dodd, Debbie Anderson, Courtney Proven, Renee Hardy, Mary Ryder, Shelby Leggett, Mary Coos, Marianne McNally, Karen Beth St. George, Bianca Hyde, Julie Smith, Andrew Lynn, Elizabeth Parmenter, Sandy Breimer, Tracy Halberg, Jenny Giger, Leila Perriello, Lisa Swartz, Catherine Jordan, Donna Craig, Jody Ogren, Liz Button, Kathy Zerker, and Ben Rathert.
For science, empathy, and cuteness.
I want to see how the world turns round. Let's go adventure in the deep blue sea. Home is with you wherever that